Um, Today we have the privilege of having with us Dr. Wayne Bowen, Professor of History and Director of Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Central Florida. Dr. Bowen holds the following degrees. He's got a Bachelor of Arts, Southern California in History, a Master of Strategic Studies at the U.S. Army War College, a Master of Arts in Northwestern University in History, PhD at Northwestern in European History. He's an accomplished author and has written extensively on themes related to the history of Spain. He wrote books on Truman, Franco, Spain, the Cold War, Churchill and Spain, the Spanish and the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, Spain and the American Civil War, also a military history of modern Spain. And I understand he's completing a book on Spain and the Protestant Reformation. So his last presentation at our group here was on England and the American Civil War. That was about a year and a half ago. And so today, Professor Bowen will share with us an exciting lecture titled Churchill and Spain. So on behalf of the English-Speaking Union, Central Florida branch, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Wayne Bowen. Bowen?
I'm always concerned when someone says, this is going to be an exciting lecture, or he's going to be great. I was chatting with some people earlier. I always like to lower expectations. That way, if I'm like, okay, you'll think, well, that was better than I expected. So in any case, I appreciate being here. I think I mentioned the last presentation here that my grandmother was Helen Urbich was a long-standing member of the ESU, and she also had a little teacup with Queen Elizabeth on her bedside. So I guess I have a familiar relation to this group, so it's great to be here. So you see here the grand man that I'm talking about, and I'm almost embarrassed to talk about Churchill, and you'll see why here in just a minute. When many people think about Churchill, I think it's fair to say Spain is not the first thing that comes to mind. They may think about the Blitz or about his leadership of the UK during the Second World War, maybe even that he liked to drink a lot, tell jokes, lots of anecdotes about how he was hilarious with people, even when they weren't realizing it. He had a really phenomenal presence across European history, especially obviously within the United Kingdom. But I'm going to try to make a case today that paying attention to Spain and Churchill is at least worth 45 minutes or so. I'm going to do something different, which I don't normally do. I'm going to start at the beginning with the end, with a summary. I think, again, because it's the nature of Churchill, he's so unusual and so giant, it's hard to imagine the 20th century without him. So I'll start at the end. He had really an unfair advantage over the rest of us by having so many achievements. It's kind of embarrassing. I served in the Army for 30 years, retired as a colonel. But I compare myself to what Churchill accomplished just in his military career, and I'm a little bit embarrassed, a little bit ashamed. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant, or if we're in the UK, lieutenant, after some struggles getting through Sandhurst Military Academy. He did graduate. You can see a picture of him in his dashing uniform. He was commissioned in a regiment. The British military is a regimental system, so you would start off with this affiliation and typically retain that for much of your career. And the first thing he did was, I'll get to that in a second. But the first thing he did related to Spain. But over the course of his military career, he served honorably in India. He had some heroic exploits during the Boer War, including leading an escape from a prison camp. And all through these adventures, he wrote voraciously and was published in English newspapers, wrote a number of books about it. Initially, this began as a way to make money, because even though he came from a long aristocratic name, he was not necessarily that rich. And so he very quickly realized that people would pay for him to read what he wrote. And so he had a long, illustrious career. He served courageously as a battalion commander during the First World War, taking leave from politics to serve on the front, which if you know anything about the First World War, you know this is no joyride. It was a pretty miserable experience for that year. He's also was a globally known author, and Ovid mentioned that I've written a few books. I have not. My 9th book coming out, and I look at Churchill, 30 books, and I just feel inadequate. So I'll just put that up there. He wrote not just nonfiction, not just about the history of the English people and the English language, but about his exploits, exploits in the Boer War, adventures in India. He wrote several novels, and for his accomplishments, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. If it wasn't bad enough, I don't anticipate that will be in my future, but nonetheless, I point this out just to illustrate that had this been all that he did, he still would be a remarkable man. If he just served in this British Army and won the Nobel Prize for Literature, he would be a man that we would learn about and we would read about. But of course, as you know, these aren't even the most important things about Churchill's life, at least from our perspective. To say he had a long political life is really an understatement. He was continuously a member of the British Parliament from 1900 to 1964, other than a 2-year period when he was out of office in the midst of a change in his political inclinations. It's amazing. And he wasn't just a member of Parliament. He was a leader in multiple governments, not only prime minister, but prime minister twice for extended periods of time. He began as a conservative, shifted to the Liberal Party, then changed his inclination as he felt the Liberal Party was moving too far to the left, too closely affiliated with socialism, and too willing to make alliances with the Labour Party. Became a conservative again in 1924 and remained in that identification for the rest of his life. He held a variety of extremely high-level positions. Some of it went badly. You may have heard of Gallipoli, the catastrophe during the First World War. It was all his fault. He took full responsibility for it, leading to the loss of thousands of British and especially Australian, New Zealand soldiers in the attack on the Ottoman Empire. But the rest of his career was a little more successful after that terrible failure. But I just put this up here to give a sense of the duration. Again, if he had only been in office during World War II, he would be worthy of note. But the fact is that during the First World War, to the end of the to the Cold War, in the depths of that conflict, he was a key world leader. It's really hard to imagine that happening again. We tend to churn through our leaders fairly quickly, but he is a solid presence in British politics in 2 centuries. The 20th century began in 1901, you might remember, so he's quite a significant person across this duration. Now we get to Spain, finally. I mentioned he was commissioned in 1895, and as was the tradition, he immediately took leave. And since he was a member of the officer class, leaves could be as long as you wanted. You could go for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, a year. You were still an officer. You're still expected to eventually return to your regiment. If that was your sole source of income, there was obviously a limit to it, but it was a gentlemanly service at the time. Now, when I was in the Army, we didn't get that kind of leave. But nonetheless, a different time, a different world. He told his commanding officer he was going on leave to the British West Indies. He was going to visit, perhaps Jamaica, the United States, British Virgin Islands. He lied. He went straight to Cuba, which was then in the midst of an insurrection against Spain. He was so excited about being a soldier, he wanted to see it firsthand. And so, taking advantage of some connections he's had with the Spanish government, he became an unofficial observer to the Spanish army, which was fighting a very brutal war against even more brutal Cuban rebels. Cuba was the site of many insurrections against Spanish control in the 19th century. There was a 10-year war from 1868 to 1878. There was the rebellion that began in 1895. And then, of course, the United States came in a few years later in the Spanish-American War, also trying to manage the Cuban situation. He came under fire by Cuban rebels. He claimed to his superiors that didn't actually happen. But at least one historian has gone back and written an entire book on this experience, and it's pretty clear. He was shot at. He may even have returned fire. It's not clear. But nonetheless, it was an invigorating experience for him. And it's important to point out that he is in Cuba essentially supporting Spanish colonial rule. This makes complete sense. I mean, he was an imperialist. He believed in the British Empire. He also was a fan of the Spanish Empire. Really, any European empire except a German one. He came back. He had to explain, yeah, actually, I was in Cuba, especially after columns that he wrote appeared in the New York Times and other newspapers, extolling his adventures and the exciting things that he had seen in Cuba. But nonetheless, it was an incredible experience for him and really made him eager to see conflict. He did later, as I mentioned, he saw service in the Boer War in South Africa, as well as in India. But he came back to Europe, serving with his regiment, and as I highlighted earlier, he was elected to office in 1900, and then served thereafter in the reserves, not in active military service. He was, as no surprise, a monarchist. He had connections throughout Europe to other aristocratic families, and this led in the spring of 1914 to a visit to Spain. This was his first significant trip to Europe, and he's a guest of the King of Spain, who had heard about his adventure in Cuba and was pleased that a British officer had decided to align himself with Spain, even though Spain had since lost Cuba to the United States, along with Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Guam. Nonetheless, he had this connection. He was also friends with the then Duke of Alba, Jacobo Fitzjames Stuart, who was a dual British Spanish citizen, held titles of nobility in both countries, and was actually had a claim to the throne of England through the Stuart line. He didn't attempt to claim the throne, but nonetheless, he was a highly aristocratic friend, the Duke of Alba was, and was also quite accomplished. You can see him here next to Churchill. Churchill has the white kippa hat on, but the Duke of Alba was an accomplished polo player, thank you. Won the silver medal at the Olympics. Churchill was not quite up to that skill, but nonetheless they played polo, went hunting, had a great adventure there in Spain in the spring of 1914. So he does develop a great affection for Spain. He samples Spanish wine for the first time, and as I'll point out later, he maintains some affection for that particular beverage through the rest of his life. And it also reinforces his sense of identification with the Spanish monarchy, with the Spanish aristocracy, with Spain as a country. It's a fondness that he'll keep for the rest of his life. Did I skip that slide? I'm sorry. Did you see this slide? I'm so sorry. I got ahead of myself. So I mentioned the Duke of Alba. That's a picture of him with Churchill there. That's them with the ponies. That was the ponies in my title. And I think I mentioned all of these things, but he did have a great time in Spain. It doesn't really smell much in these pictures, but I think that belies that he really did have a joyful time. Okay. I apologize. Spain doesn't really re-enter Churchill's life until 1936, and that is when the Spanish Civil War begins. This is a conflict between right-wing Spain and left-wing Spain. On the left, the Popular Front, which is a group made up of the communists, socialists, anarchists, separatist groups from the Basque region and Catalonia. And on the right, the nationalists, conservatives, Catholics, monarchists, and Spain's Falange, or Spain's fascist party. It's a brutal civil war that will last for almost 3 years. You can see Spain divided. The nationalists in pink, the Popular Front are the Republicans in sort of blue. Now, Churchill in 1836 is not a man of significance. He is a backbencher, which in the Parliament of the United Kingdom means, basically, if you're in the front row, it means you matter. If you've ever seen a picture of the British Parliament, it kind of goes up. The people who sit up against the wall in the back, they're the least important, least consequential. They speak the least amount. They don't really matter. The Prime Minister, all the leading ministers are in the front few rows. So he's not significant. He's not a major foreign policy maker. He's not really involved in the discussions. There is, however, a conservative government controlling Spain at the time, so it's his party. At least he's in the party that's in power. And at the time, the British were very concerned that the Spanish Civil War might spread. This is 1936, so Hitler's in power, Mussolini is in power. There has been some initial aggressive moves by both of them. There's also lots of problems in France. France has, similar to Spain, a popular front made up of communists, socialists, and anarchists, and the British are terrified that the civil war that began in Spain might spread to France, involving the same factions, the same groups. And so the British, along with most of the other governments in Europe, signed what is called the Non-Intervention Agreement, by which they promised not to send weapons, not to send forces, not to intervene in the least, let the Spanish fight it out amongst themselves. If you know anything about the Spanish Civil War, you know that the Germans and Italians ignored this, sent weapons to the nationalists, led by Francisco Franco. The Soviet Union also ignored it and sent weapons to the Popular Front, to the communists especially. The British and the French pretended this wasn't happening, because the alternative was to accept that it was happening and then to be forced to take a side or to do something to intervene. The British really have a negative goal here. They want things not to happen. They don't have a positive vision for Spain or hope that someday Spain will be like the United Kingdom or like the United States. They just want things to not to happen. They don't want it to become communist. They don't want it to become an ally of the Nazis. They don't want it to cause the war to spread, and they don't want any British property to be seized. There are extensive British investments in Spain in the 1920s and 30s, the most significant being the Rio Tinto mines, which are in the south of the country. And so all these no's are really forward in the minds of Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, and to a certain extent for Churchill. Now, Churchill's a little more pro-Franco. Again, he identifies with the conservatives in the Civil War. He identifies with the monarchists. He's not a fan of the fascists, but they're all on the same side, so he's much more supportive of that side. He is absolutely against the communists taking over. He views a Soviet Spain becoming an ally of the Soviet Union as the worst possible outcome, much worse than even it becoming a Nazi ally. So that's really where Churchill's perspective is, and that's reflected in British policy as well. They don't want it to become a Nazi state, but even worse would be for it to become communist in the minds of the British. And of course, they're terrified of the conflict spreading to France. The Second World War comes relatively soon after the Spanish Civil War ends. Spanish Civil War ends in April of 39. First World War in Europe at least begins September of 39, so just a few months there. But the wars are not directly connected. So the concern that the British had that this would spread and magnify did not actually happen. But that doesn't mean that fear went away. Because since the winning side of the Spanish Civil War, the Nationalists had received direct aid from the Nazis, as well as from fascist Italy, there was an expectation that at some point Spain might enter the war on the side of the Axis, which would spread the conflict dramatically, and also threaten Gibraltar, which British controlled from 1714 on, and of course the British Empire in general. You can see a quote here from Churchill that he said in 39, just above the Franco picture, basically saying that Spain has to stay neutral, because for it to do otherwise would be to threaten the British, threaten the French, really cause the extension of this conflict dramatically. Spain, as I said, received support from the Nazis during the Spanish Civil War, and at certain points in the spring of 1940 and summer of 1940, it seemed as if Spain was heading toward war on the side of the Axis. There were even negotiations. Churchill did everything he could to prevent this from happening. So I have some of those things listed here. He began a program of bribing Spanish generals. In a dictatorship in which the military was dominant, this seemed like a smart thing to do. There were lots of monarchists and conservatives among Franco's coalition who were predisposed to be pro-British. So writing them a check here and there seemed to be a good measure to try to ensure this would happen. And indeed, the military remained, on the whole, pro-British during the war, or at least not pro-Nazi. Churchill was also quite concerned that the Germans might attack Gibraltar, either with or without permission of the Spanish. Indeed, the Germans had very advanced plans to do so. In the fall of 1940, they proposed to the Spanish, just let us pass through Spain, we'll take care of it, and then we'll give it to you. Seemed like a good deal. The Spanish allowed them to conduct advanced reconnaissance, to send a map-making team and a surveying team. They had the forces assembled in the fall of 1940. We're just waiting for the go order from Franco to Hitler. Fortunately, never came, but it continued to be a plan ready to go should conditions change. Churchill was quite concerned this might actually happen for good reason. He had a plan B and a plan C and a plan D on how to react, either sending directly forces to Gibraltar, possibly seizing the Spanish Canary Islands, kind of in retaliation, or even sending a mobile force to northern Spain to maybe not defeat the Germans, but at least cause them difficulties by fighting them in the mountains of the north of the country. Churchill had another problem, which isn't on this slide, but you may have heard of this. King George VIII abdicated in 1936 to marry an American woman, Wallis Simpson. Yes, exactly, the Duke of Windsor. He moved after his abdication to France. When the Germans entered France, however, he moved to Spain. And so the Duke of Windsor in the summer of 1940 is in Spain. He then moves to Portugal. As you may know, or maybe you don't know, he was quite sympathetic to the Germans. He expressed anti-Semitic views at various points, and there was some discussion that he might be a Quisling, that he might be willing to work with the Germans who could put him back on the throne of the United Kingdom. And he is in Spain, a semi-allied country to the Axis, in the summer of 1940, just as Germans have overrun France and the British have evacuated the continent. And so you can imagine this was quite concerning to Churchill, that here was a former British monarch who was meeting with German agents, who was open to the idea, who had toured Germany and been impressed by the Luftwaffe and said some really positive things about Herr Hitler. This was another worry on Churchill's plate in the summer and fall of 1940. Fortunately, they came up with a plan to move the Duke of Windsor out of Europe. They named him governor of the Bahamas. He was not happy about it, complained the whole time he was governor, insisted on massive renovations of his mansion there. Anyway, that's another story. But nonetheless, this just adds to the problems that Spain is causing Churchill in the summer of 1940. Churchill, fortunately, could rely on the economic weakness of Spain. Spain was absolutely dependent on the British and on the Americans for oil, for wheat. And on the other hand, they had almost nothing that the British and the Americans needed. They had tungsten ore, sometimes known as wolfram, which is important for artillery, for aviation, but and so the British and the Americans paid more for it than it was worth to keep it out of the hands of the Germans. But really, the economic dependence of Spain was one of the vital links that kept Spain out of the war, and Churchill was very careful to push this issue with the Spanish to make sure they realized, well, of course you can enter the war, but then how will you feed your people? Of course you can get into the war, but what fuel will go into your trucks? And this proved to be an effective policy through the war. Spain was also helpful in one episode. I don't know if you have Netflix, I really encourage you to watch the movie Operation Mincemeat. Extremely well done. Very accurate, at least from as far as I could tell. And the very few limited scenes that are in Spain are just perfect, just dead on. So someone agrees with me. If you haven't seen it, Mincemeat was basically an operation by which the British tricked the Germans. They delivered the body of what seemed to be a Royal Marine onto the coast of Spain, with the expectation that the secret papers he had would make their way into German intelligence, which it did. And the paper said that the Allied invasion in the summer of 43 was going to come to Greece and Sardinia, when, of course, the Allies were coming to Sicily. And it seems likely that the Germans fell for this. So, nonetheless, Churchill gave the approval for this. He liked fantastic ideas. I mean, he was always one to listen to a crazy idea. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. But didn't always give final approval, but he would let you, make an attempt. The end of the war came with some humiliation for Churchill. At the moment when he is at Potsdam, which is one of the meetings, the final meetings of the Allied leaders to resolve what will happen with Germany, what will happen with the rest of Europe, his Conservative Party is defeated in an election. The British people were tired of war. They were tired of talking about war. They wanted peace. They wanted homes for heroes. They wanted a return to the quiet of before the conflict. And they weren't interested in his rumblings about a conflict with the communists and about how we have to keep fighting and we're not going to let go of any of our colonies. They were just done and tired. His party lost. He actually had to come home from that meeting because he was no longer the prime minister. Changes of power happened quite quickly in the UK. So he's out of power. He's still a member of parliament. And during this time when he's a member of parliament but out of power, he comes to the United States at the invitation of Truman, gives this famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, which really defines the Western view of the world. Up until this point, there was still some uncertainty. Can we work with the communists? Can we divide Europe? Can we have some kind of cooperative understanding? And Churchill says no. Look at the behavior of Stalin. Look at the behavior of the communists. It's impossible to deal with them. And this is from someone who had, during the Second World War, dealt with Stalin and the Soviet Union on a daily basis. So he had the legitimacy, not only from having been one of the big three who won the war, but honestly having tried to work with the communists and tried to avoid a Cold War. He'd always been skeptical of communism. Okay. I didn't do that. He defines the West's understanding of the Cold War. The Conservatives return to power in 1951, and he is back as prime minister. And at this point, he is really helping to shape Europe just as the Cold War is accelerating quite significantly. And in this moment, his leadership is important relating to Spain. Spain, as we talked about, had been neutral but basically pro-Nazi during the war. And surprisingly, people remembered this after the conflict. So Spain was isolated. It was not allowed to join the United Nations. Almost all countries of the world withdrew their ambassadors. There were limits on its trade and ability to conduct itself as a normal nation. But by the late 40s, accelerated by Churchill's speech, as I mentioned, people began to realize that there were, World War II was the last conflict. We're now in a new one. And a country which had been anti-communist and which had been anti-Soviet suddenly sounded a little bit better than one that had been also pro-Nazi. And so 1948, 1949, 1950, advisors to President Truman, advisors to initially the Labor government, then to Churchill were saying, look, we need Spain. If the Soviet tanks invade Europe and they overrun Germany and the French are worthless, what are we going to do? Sorry, I shouldn't have said that, but I did. And they were saying it at the time. If they surrender again, what will we do? And so the mountains to the south of France, the Pyrenees, and the fact that Spanish soldiers were known to be tough, and the fact that it was at some distance from the border with the Soviet Union, and that Spain was an anti-communist country, suddenly seemed to be attractive. So the idea of having naval bases, air bases in Spain as a backup suddenly began to make a lot of sense. And so in the late 40s and early 50s, the Truman administration begins to negotiate an agreement. Now, I wrote a book about this, so I know it's true. Truman hated Spain. He hated Franco. He would do anything possible to avoid cutting a deal. But the Cold War was more important than his personal feelings, so he got over it. Took him 5 years, but he got over it. Churchill is an important prompt in this discussion. There were concerns among the British and the French that if the U.S. began to give aid to Spain, it would reduce the amount that the British would get, that the French would get, that the Marshall Plan would distribute. But Churchill said, we understand that. Of course, we hope that the U.S. doesn't reduce support to us, but Spain is important. Spain is important. It will take pressure off the U.K. That's a quote from him. And he realized that if it came to a global war with the Soviet Union, that perhaps it would end up being the UK and Spain again, with the rest of Europe overrun, as it happened in the not-too-distant past. So he's an indispensable support at a key time to make that basing agreement happen. And it ends up being President Eisenhower, a few months after he takes office, that finalizes the basing agreement with Spain. So, as you mentioned, after leaving office in 55, did we go on yet? There we go. Okay. I'll explain the pictures, I promise. So Truman remains as a member of Parliament until 1964, but he's out of office in 1955, and he uses the fact that he doesn't have a lot of responsibility to go on a lot of trips around Europe. He takes up painting, or he continues his painting adventures, and this connection to Spain continues. I mentioned he had developed a taste for Spanish wine. It was not the only alcoholic beverage that he drank, as you know. He also liked champagne, a couple bottles a day. He liked whiskey. He liked sherry. He said once, I think, "I've gotten more from alcohol than it ever got from me." And I think that's true in his case. From his time in Cuba, he developed a fondness for Cuban cigars. You may have seen him carrying a cigar at one point. Those were invariably Cuban. He would have them shipped over specially, sometimes even surreptitiously in the diplomatic pouch, to make sure he was never without his cigars. And by some accounts, he would go through even a dozen a day. Not always smoking them, but always keeping them lit and around. He did eventually make it to Spain itself. He was a tourist. You can see the picture here. He's kind of the bent man in the middle there. As a guest of Aristotle Onassis, you may have heard of, who was married to former Jacqueline Kennedy, one of the richest men in the world in the 60s and 70s, Greek shipping tycoon. He took Churchill on his private yacht to the Canary Islands, to Barcelona, all these places. If you're going to travel with a Greek shipping tycoon. They apparently had a great time. Churchill painted, fished, just had a delightful time. The Barcelona connection to me is quite interesting. At least 4 times that I can tell, he specifically mentioned Barcelona when he was referring to the struggles the British faced in 1940. During the Spanish Civil War, Barcelona had been the subject of pretty strong air attacks from German forces as well as by Franco's nationalist air force. Stories about the suffering of the people of Barcelona came across newspapers and other media, and he was apparently very moved by it. In fact, he encouraged his own people to by this example that the Spanish in Barcelona, the Catalans in Barcelona had endured, that they could do it too. He didn't have to refer to Barcelona. In fact, it was a little bit out of character, given that his greatest affection was for conservative Spain. He had supported more or less the Francoist side in the war, and these were victims of Franco's forces. And I think that Catalonia was so moved, the province was so moved by it, that the people of Barcelona raised money and put up a statue to him 10 years ago. And you can see it here, up in the top right. You can see his face on that pillar. The International Churchill Society was there for the inauguration. It was a big deal. And he's popular elsewhere. You can see the Sir Winston Churchill pub on the bottom right there. If you explore their website, it's pretty amazing. They have, monogrammed Churchill things everywhere, pictures of him, and it's somewhat inexplicable because he never, as far as I can tell, never went to Bilbao, has no connection to that city. But I did a little bit of searching, and I found at least 5 restaurants in Spain that are named the Churchill something for him. Probably taking advantage of his image of someone who enjoyed a good time, liked to drink, liked to smoke. Several of them pointed out their glorious humidors if you're a cigar smoker. So even though these are not connected to his political life, not connected really to anything he did that relates to Spain itself, he does continue to echo in Spain. This great man intersected Spain in much more limited ways than he did in many other countries. But nonetheless, I thought it was worthy of our chat today, and I hope it's been interesting to you, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
over on this side.
Which book did he receive the Nobel Prize in Literature